Hey guys, today we're in the book of Leviticus, chapter 16. Now, before we get into today, really what the whole book of Leviticus is pointing to, remember what we've gone through. The first 7 chapters were about the sacrifices. Chapters 8 through 10 were about the priest. Chapters 11 through 15 were about what purity is. And now today we get to chapter 16 and tomorrow, chapter 17, talking about this Day of Atonement. Now, what's interesting is we call it the Day of Atonement, but those words really aren't used until later on in the book of Leviticus. But here in chapter 16, we get kind of what the whole book is pointing to. And it says, the Lord spoke to Moses after the death of his 2 sons of Aaron, that would be Nadab and Abihu, right after they died, were killed in Leviticus chapter 10 for going into the temple in an unworthy manner. He says, tell Aaron, your brother, not to come at any time into the holy place inside the veil before the mercy seat of the ark, so that he may not die. For I will appear in a cloud over the mercy seat. If you remember chapter 10, where Aaron's sons died because they went into the temple in an unworthy manner, here God is telling Aaron, the high priest, he may not come in unless he's invited or an appointed time. There's a very specific time where he can come into the most holy place. And now we're going to get the description of that time, of that day. But in this way, Aaron shall come into the holy place with a bull from the herd for a sin offering and a ram for the burnt offering. Before he comes in, he must atone for his own sins. Remember, the high priest is just a man. He is a sinner. So when it's talking about this bull, this is to cleanse Aaron of his sins before he comes back in to represent all of Israel. Okay? So he has to atone for his own sins with a bull for a sin offering and a burnt offering. Verse 4, he shall put on the holy linen coat, the linen undergarment, the linen sash, the linen turban. Then he will put on the high priest garb, right? All those things that we read about in previous chapters. He will dress up in the holy priest wear, but before he does, he shall bathe, verse 4, in water and put them on. He has to cleanse himself before he does. And he shall take from the congregation, the people of Israel, 2 male goats for a sin offering and 1 ram for a burnt offering. So here we see that as he's getting ready, he has to offer a bull for himself, and for Israel, he has to get 2 goats and a ram. Now, the ram is a burnt offering. Remember, that's completely burned up to God. That's just showing respect to God. But the 2 goats are for the sin offering. Let's see. Verse 6, Aaron shall offer the bull as a sin offering for himself and shall make atonement for himself. And as you read this, you're going to notice the word himself over and over and over and over again. The high priest had to do all of this himself. He had to sacrifice the bull. He had to sacrifice the goat. All this was dependent on one man, right? Only through one man could sin be covered, right? So I hope that's kind of giving you some thoughts of some New Testament language. So Aaron has to do all this, but notice verse 8, and Aaron shall cast lots over the 2 goats, 1 lot for the Lord and the other lot for the Azel, or in Hebrew it's called the Azazel. Okay, the Azazel. This simply translates to the escape goat or the removal of goat. Okay, so we will see this translated in lots of other translations as the scapegoat. That's the true transliteration of the word. So he has 2 goats. One he's going to cast lots over. So you remember Probably the Uman and the Thummim, right? The black and the white, or the dark and the light colored. And he would cast over, and God would say, so which goat is going to go to God, is going to be sacrificed, and one is going to be let go. So he would cast lots to figure out which one is for. So only one of the two goats will be killed. Okay, and that'll make more sense as we read. And Aaron will present these goats on the lot which the Lord said, and the goat on which the lot fell shall be presented alive before the Lord to make atonement over it, and it shall be sent away into the wilderness. And we'll talk more about that. Verse 11 goes back up into, so you kind of 1 through 10 is kind of the summary of the whole chapter. It kind of just briefly goes over it. Starting in verse 11, we get detail of all the things that happen between verses 1 through 10. So starting in verse 11, it's about the offering of the bull that Aaron would have to make for his own sins, not for Israel, but for his own sins, right? So he says, Aaron shall take the bull, he's going to sacrifice it. He shall take a censer full of coals from the fire, from the altar before the Lord, and 2 handfuls of sweet incense beaten small, and shall bring it inside the veil, and put the incense on the fire before the Lord, that the cloud of the incense may cover. So as he's coming into the Holy of Holies, he has to take some of the fire from the altar. This is God fire. Remember, God started that fire. So he has to bring God fire in. He puts it in. He puts the incense. Then it fills the holy, the most holy place, right? It fills it up with a cloud. It's kind of the idea that there is a separation of this cloud of incense between the holy God and the unholy man, right? So it's putting a barrier between the glory of God and mankind. And he shall take some of the blood of the bull which was sacrificed for his sins, Aaron, and sprinkle it with his finger on the front of the mercy seat on the east side, and the front of the mercy seat shall sprinkle some of the blood 7 times. So he dips his finger in a basin of blood, and he puts some on the east side, which is the closest to the door. He puts some on the front, and then he sprinkles it 7 times, flicking 7 times blood on top of the golden lid of the Ark of the Covenant, the mercy seat. Then he shall kill the goat of the sin offering that is for the people, and bring its blood inside of the veil, and do it the blood as he did with the blood. So he has these 2 goats. He's already taken them before the door of the tabernacle, and he cast lots, and God told him which goat he wanted. One goat gets sacrificed, okay, and that's the blood, that's the one we're talking about. So the goat that got sacrificed, he collects its blood, does the same, goes inside, sprinkles on the east side, sprinkles on the front, and then 7 times flings the blood. So the blood of the bull was to cover the sins of Aaron, or the high priest. The blood of the goat was to cover the sins of all of Israel, okay? Then he shall kill the goat. We talked about that as the people. Verse 16, thus he shall make atonement for the holy place. So as he's doing this, he is not just atoning the sins of Israel, he's atoning the place of the sins of the holy place. And you might ask yourself, why is there sins in the holy place, right? Where the Ark of the Covenant is, that's where God is. There would be no sin. But remember, the tabernacle is a tent. It gets moved. As God moves on in a pillar of cloud, a pillar of fire, they would have to reset up the tabernacle. So as they're resetting up, man's hands, right, the hands of the Israel priest are touching this. They're getting it ready. They would not touch the Ark of the Covenant because it has poles, but the linens, the poles, all the things that were around, it's been touched by hands. Well, why would that bring sin into the tent of meeting? Remember everything that we have read in Leviticus. Remember, I've told you, Leviticus all leads up to this point. When something is unclean, touches something that is clean, it makes it unclean, right? So the transference of uncleanliness or sin happens. So man who is full of sin, who breaks God's laws, even though they are priests, when they fold up the tent and they move the tent and they set it all back up, because they are sinful, they touch things that are not sinful, it makes it sinful. So when Aaron goes in and he is sacrificing for his sin, he is also sacrificing and cleansing, making new again the holy place, right? Verse 16. Also in verse 16, the tent of meeting, the whole tent itself. And then in verse 18, even the altar that's on the outside of the tent of meeting, but still in the court of the tabernacle. All of these are being atoned for, making atonement for it. And he shall sprinkle some of the blood on it in his finger 7 times and cleanse it and consecrate it. Verse 20, and when he has made an end for the atoning of the holy place, the tent of the meeting and the altar, he shall present the live goat, right? So the blood of the bull has already been in there. The blood of the goat has already been in there. He is now atoned for the whole place, right? The holy place, the tent of meeting, and the altar. And when this is all done, Aaron, the high priest, will bring out the live goat. There was 2. One is dead, one is alive. And Aaron shall lay both of his hands on the head of the goat and confess over it all the sins. It's the same idea that we saw in chapters 1 through 7, the sacrifices. To confess, it means to press, right? He would press down, implying that he is putting all the sins of Israel and himself into this goat. And he shall put them on the head of the goat and send it away into the wilderness by the hand of a man who is in readiness. And the goat shall bear all of their iniquities on itself to a remote area, and he shall let the goat free in the wilderness. Now, in Jewish writings, we're told that there would be another priest who would kind of halter this goat and would take it out and would go 10 miles outside of the camp of Israel. And that person would take that goat who has all of its sins of Israel. He would take it and he would not kill it. He would walk it 10 miles out and he would shoo that goat away until it walked beyond the horizon, till you couldn't see it anymore, showing that the sins, right, have been taken away, right? They haven't been erased. They haven't been erased, but they have been removed, right? Removed from the camp. And so that's what it is referring to. And Aaron shall come into the tent of meeting and shall take off the linen garments, and he bathes his body. He puts back on his normal clothes. Verse 27, and the bull, the sin offering, the goat for the sin offering, whose blood was brought into the to make atonement in the holy place, shall be carried outside of the camp. Their skin and their flesh and their tongue shall be burned up with fire. So all the things that God didn't want in the sin offering and in the burnt offering was taken outside of camp and burnt, just like we learned in Leviticus 1 through 7. This is what the priest would do. Verse 29, and it shall be a statute to you forever, that in the 7th month, on the 10th day of the month, you shall afflict yourselves, and shall do not work, neither the native or the stranger who sojourns among you. Afflict yourselves, humble yourselves. Today, Jews will fast. They will do charitable work. They will give a lot of money to charitable places. They'll do lots of different things, but it truly just means to humble yourself, right? So the Day of Atonement was to humble yourself, to think less of yourself, to bother yourself so that God would get all of the glory. But also you shall clean yourself before the Lord. Verse 31, it is a Sabbath of solemn rest to you. Not only is a Sabbath every 7th day, but the Day of Atonement was also a day of rest. And it says this will be a statute forever. And even today, you go to Israel on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, it even happens. And even a lot of people today, a lot of Orthodox Jews will still sacrifice, but they sacrifice roosters and chickens. And they will do that within their house. There is no temple, but they will do things like of that nature. Verse 34 tells us that this will be done once a year because all of their sins. And Aaron did as the Lord commanded. So here, everything has been leading up to this Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. The word Kippur or Kippur means to cover. It's the day of covering. So the idea of sprinkling blood on the mercy seat on the lid of the covenant is to cover the sins. As God is in this cloud of glory looking down at the Ark of the Covenant, which had 10 commandments, had the Aaron's budding staff, had the jar of manna. This were all the things where man proved they were not holy. So something had to, as God is above and man is here, holy and unholy, something had to come in between to make this sin, the lack of following the commandments, the grumbling over the manna, the sin that caused Aaron's budding staff, right? All these things that happen, something had to come in between, cover the sins of man. And that was the blood that was sprinkled on the mercy seat. Now you might ask yourself, where's Jesus in this? Well, he everywhere. He's this chapter and the next chapter. He's everywhere, right? But I want to point you to two things. One verse, starting in verse 15 and through verse 17, we get messianic prophecy, talking about that Jesus once and for all dies for us. Right? This is not something that he has to do every year because he's not covering the sin. He is completely removing it. And you can see more about that in Hebrews chapter 9, starting in verse 7 through 14. And then also in verse 27, where it says that it shall be carried outside of the camp. Once again, this is messianic prophecy. Going back to Matthew chapter 27, Jesus was taken to the place of the skull, Golgotha, which was outside of the city, outside of the camp, right? Outside of the city of Jerusalem. In Hebrews chapter 13, verses 11 and 12 tells us that Jesus suffered outside of the camp so that we may be without sin. Jesus was this sacrifice that once and for all took our sin away. Another thing that I made some notes on here was on the Day of Atonement, the high priest was three things, right? On the Day of Atonement, the priest did three things. One, he was humble, verse 4 of chapter 16. Number 2, he was spotless. He had to sacrifice sin so that he was sinless, verse 11. And then number 3 was that he was alone, verses 11 through 14. The high priest did everything. And when we think about Jesus Christ, he was humble. He humbled himself and took the nature of man. He bore our sins, though he was without sin. He was spotless. And then also he was alone. As he went to the Garden of Gethsemane, he was alone. And then alone on the cross, he bore all of our sins. And so you can see in chapter 16 and tomorrow in chapter 17, not only was he the sacrifice, but he was a picture of that perfect high priest. Hope that makes a little bit more sense, and we'll see you tomorrow in chapter 17. God bless.